Don't Be Afraid is a first-person horror game where you play as David, a young boy who's been kidnapped by a psychopathic killer and must escape his deadly house of puzzles. The game is available on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, PC, and features strong themes of violence towards children. Atmosphere. The music is dreamlike, and the layout of the basement and house can be quite confusing and surreal, with bodies and mannequins littered everywhere. It does sometimes push the level of realism into the nightmarish, with the makeshift nature to everything making it look like a low-budget maze from the Saw franchise.
David, oh, we're having so much fun. You're so obedient and polite. Oh, I think you deserve a treat. But before that, I have one more request for you. Would you kindly enter this box? If you do, I might think about letting you go.
Thanks to the puzzled environments, there's a strong sense of foreboding that carries on until the later game, with the voice of your kidnapper, Franklin, taunting you and testing you throughout. There's a sense of hopelessness as every action you do is obviously bad for David, but Franklin makes it seem as though you have to do them to be let go, that being compliant will somehow get you out of it. The situation is deeply unpleasant, and the fact that it's all befalling a child is disturbing, which is the main thing that lingers on throughout the game. It becomes obvious after a while that the traps themselves don't necessarily harm David, but it doesn't stop them from being frightening or intimidating, with the added vulnerability of being a child making things like being left in the dark panic-inducing on occasions. It also shows the plight of the other children who were taken by Franklin, and it and the various mentions of child cruelty permeate the experience. The game eventually loses a lot of what it built in the first half, with the latter parts of the game resembling more of a fever dream, and many things end up losing their meaning. But nevertheless, the themes the game covers are frankly upsetting and loom over the entire experience. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game has quite a few jump scares, and they're a bit of a mixed bag, with some landing and others falling flat due to timing errors or just being predictable, like mannequins moving around when you aren't looking. The game's monsters and chase sequences are extremely lackluster. When an enemy finds you, it follows you relentlessly, and it's impossible to shake some of them, but thanks to their repeating voice lines, silly running animations, and a general non-frightening appearance, they aren't very intimidating. When you're caught, the death or losing animation is extremely underwhelming, and it makes dying more of an annoyance than anything else. The one thing the game does best is showing something incredibly intimidating and then having Franklin tell you that you need to do something obviously dangerous in order to progress, like unlocking the chain on a monster's collar. There's several really creepy or unexplained things in the game that are just unpleasant to be around, but by far the most unsettling parts of the game are sections where David is confronted by Franklin directly, with some scenes being creepy to just difficult to stomach.
Sorry, my darling. I just couldn't resist.
Whilst the game tries a lot, it's mostly down to implementation when something doesn't work, or an underwhelming execution. The game tries so many different things that don't work or fail to land, but it does have one or two moments that are genuinely creepy or unpleasant. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The music really boils down to one track that's played constantly, a dreamlike but unsettling low-pitched whispery whine that's soaked in reverb. It's very low in the mix but unmistakably there, and contrasts very heavily against the loud sound effects. The chase music and incidental jump scare music are both effective but are pretty generic. The sound effects themselves are pretty creepy, even if some of them seem stock. The reverb placed on them is very heavy and makes the environments feel immensely large. It's almost unrealistic, but it really helps the atmosphere regardless. The sound effects have a bad habit of being repeated way too often and not having much variety, with the same ones being repeated over and over again. The game also sometimes plays screams and grunts at random, with noises emanating from somewhere else in the area rather than baked into the soundtrack, which comes across as more genuine. The voice acting is extremely limited, and like some of the sound effects, it's repeated heavily.
Here in the forest, dark and deep, I offer you eternal sleep. Here in the forest, dark and deep, I offer you eternal sleep. I'm coming for you. Here in the forest, dark and deep, I offer you.
Franklin is the only character to have a lot of lines, and he talks in a sickly sing-song way and laughs way too often. It sometimes comes across as creepy, but often just seems cheesy, with him laughing at the end of nearly every sentence. His voice also sometimes becomes grating, with the audio effects to simulate a loudspeaker being a bit too sharp on occasions. There's directional audio for most of the sound effects, and it helps locate enemies sometimes, which is always nice. The game's sound design has some annoying flaws that ultimately hurt the experience, and whilst it does one or two things well, it's not really enough to redeem it. That's still one Harry Mason. Gore. The game has blood or red paint over nearly every mannequin, and there are corpses stacked up in rooms all throughout the game with a very copy-paste style. The way they look is fairly harrowing, but it really pushes the realism of such a prolific killer that seems needless for a person who seemingly only targets children. Where the game really goes into the unpleasant territory is the things that befall David himself, and the violence towards children is particularly difficult to stomach. Whilst it's undeniable that it certainly leaves more of an impact because it's happening to a child, it's totally needless and the scenario is beyond uncomfortable. That's still one Harry Mason. Story. The game opens with David waking up underground in a locked cell with his kidnapper Franklin telling him that he'll be allowed to leave if he just does what he says. The story is pretty difficult to stomach, with Franklin kidnapping and mutilating various children and making threats to kill them. There's a lot of notes left throughout the game, and the voice recordings are sometimes pointless to read and sometimes just reiterate the same things that Franklin himself says.
It's Andy. I found another kid. A girl. Her name is Lydia. I tried to take her with me, but this psycho already laid his dirty hands on her. I'm warning you. Be careful, be smart, play his stupid game so he won't suspect anything. Remember to look for my tapes though. I'll leave you the screwdriver on the second floor in the drawer of the desk. I have to go. Find my next tape. I'll place crayons on the floor so you can easily find the right desk.
David also has some flashbacks that lead him to getting kidnapped, and whilst the early ones are difficult to understand why they've even been included, the last one is truly unpleasant. There's multiple endings due to David being able to follow a trail of letters from the previous children that seemingly allow him to escape, but following Franklin's orders leads to possibly the most grim ending I've ever seen. The story isn't deep, its subject matter is more for shock value than anything else, and it has a habit of falling over itself to tell you things you didn't need to know, making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. Don't Be Afraid has some incredibly unpleasant scenes that make playing it difficult. Whilst it has a decent atmosphere and some scary moments, it's hard to recommend because of all the caveats to every section. Again, I'd like to remind you, the whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I did everything Franklin asked, I did not think it was a good idea, and I advise you don't do it either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.